This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
I know usually we start out with like true crime news, but this is really a continuation of a conversation we were having that we sort of have been having. We've been talking about these EPANA cases in Canada, and there was a set of cases going on time-wise that sort of mimic the time frame of the EPANA. Although EPANA sort of has a sprawling. I think it starts in 1969 or so, and like the most recent case up there is like 2006. This case that we briefly touched on is not quite as sprawling. The Ghost of Highway 20, that sort of runs from about 1977 to 1992, and they consider it to be sort of, I don't want to say closed, but not like it's sort of solved. There's a documentary that I had you watch after I sort of posited a little bit of this information, and as I'm known to do, I sprung this on you. But did you get a chance to watch the documentary?
I did.
Okay, so the documentary is actually produced by the Oregonian, which is a daily newspaper that's based out of Portland, Oregon. It's one of the oldest newspapers on the West Coast. It was founded in like the 1850s by a guy named Thomas Dreyer, and it's published daily ever since then. And what they did was they ran multiple pieces by a woman by the name of Noelle Crombie. I think there were 5 pieces. There might have been a wrap-up in there. And these pieces were called The Ghost of Highway 20. And then they also did a documentary related to the Ghost of Highway 20. And they sort of encompassed a lot of different things. They encompassed the Neiman News was in there. They talked about the Doe Network. The Charlie Project is in there. Oregon Live is a part of it. Statesman Journal, Corvallis Gazette Times, all these different newspapers, including like I think the Albany Democrat Herald, local to that area, they sort of pull all this information together, including a lot of public records, and they put together a pretty tight documentary about a guy named John Arthur Ackroyd.
I was convinced early on that we were dealing with a serial killer.
He's always been a demon in my life, lurking in the back of my head.
There have been times people take people out, kill them, and bury them. There's other times where they've taken them out and just thrown them on the ground after they got through.
She probably ran. He got his gun out.
What are the odds of being a prime suspect in all these murders?
Officials say they do not expect to find the girl alive.
His eyes would change color, and he says, I want to kill someone.
He knew that area. He worked for the highway department.
He was a hunter. Yeah, hunters doesn't necessarily restrict it to animals.
He knew that area pretty well, didn't he?
Like the back of his hand.
I know this road like the back of my head. Same with the stations, only FM band. Farms and truck stops, fireworks stands. Yeah, I know this road like the back of my head.
Look what happens. Look what happens. I hear I'm the only freaking survivor.
So John Arthur Ackroyd is a predator. We're going to talk about what level predator he is today. He is definitely a murderer in terms of like the legal sense. And he's suspected to have been a serial killer. But he's an unusual, in a couple of ways, he's an unusual predator. Now, I'll say up front that in December of 2016, John Arthur Ackroyd died at the age of 67 in the Oregon State Penitentiary up in Salem, Oregon. He has one living victim, and he is suspected to have two murdered victims. And then there's tangential evidence of a double homicide in 1992. So let me just start out by asking, what did you think of the documentary, the way everything was put together and kind of the presentation of it all?
I liked it. I mean, it was, I don't know if I should say I like it to something of that subject matter, but I thought it was good.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty well presented. They do a pretty good job of balancing, like, the investigators talking. They have one of the victims talking. They have several of the victims' family members talking. It's a long story, and I will link to the Oregonian's story, and I will link to the actual documentary that you can watch it here in the show notes. I want to talk a little bit about the documentary itself, and then John Arthur Ackroyd, and then I want to talk about how it has sort of some similarities to the Ipana cases. Now, do you think he's a serial killer? Like, when you look at John Ackroyd?
He's definitely a killer. See, I don't want to say, like, no, I don't think he's a serial killer, because I don't know if that lessens his, like, what happened to his victims, but sort of the way the story plays out, I don't really think he's what I consider to be a serial killer. That doesn't mean I wouldn't change my mind. This is a fairly sort of, I mean, I don't know everything there is to know about this guy, right?
Yeah.
I've sort of looked into a few sources. And what do you think? Do you think he's a serial killer?
Well, so this case comes up because of similarities to the Canadian case. It comes up because, as you know, I have a thing for this area in Oregon where people have disappeared. There's a couple of people out there that were definitely predators that I've long been fascinated by their cases. And I wanted to take a look at this case because I can't figure this guy out. Now, the way that they get to him being a serial killer is, so he has in 1977, he has a living victim named Marlene, and she talks in this documentary. And she gives, like, a really specific account of how she gets away from John Ackroyd. It's pretty fascinating to listen to, and it has some things in common with the Ipana cases because Marlene is a Native American. She's an indigenous American. And the way that she describes her story and what happened between them is absolutely terrifying. And I think it's always worth listening to victim stories, not necessarily for, like, all the accuracy of the life of the person they encountered, but because of, like, the details in the firsthand accounting of it. Obviously, she's not dead, so she's a victim, but that doesn't lump into him being a serial killer. But the idea that they have here is that she is, like, the first victim, and she sort of humanizes herself very similarly to what we saw in some of the other cases we've covered this spring.
I don't know if we've talked quite a bit about this in the weeks leading up to when this is going to air. And I don't know if we talked about it or if it made it on the show. But I did find out in the documentary that she did not know him. I had questioned that earlier. Again, don't know if it's going to, make it to the show. But I said, well, are they acquaintances, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately she's looking for a ride home. And that was cleared up in the documentary from her story. She was, they were out having a good time. She had, it was the first night she had a babysitter to get away from her, like, very young baby. And she says herself that like she was, acting silly and doing something she shouldn't have been doing. And she was underage, but she had been drinking and she got mad. And so she was looking around at this venue that they were at. I think it was like the Sisters Rodeo or something like that. And she finally found a guy with a pickup to take her home. That's what she was looking for, because her husband had made her mad, and she wanted to leave. That had been a big question when we were talking about this earlier, was, well, did she know him? Because I thought they were with some friends, but it didn't sound like this guy was her friend. Now, also in the documentary, it's mentioned at some point, and I don't know if you caught it or not, and I know we're going to go through that whole story, but her husband did beat him up, right?
Yes.
And so I don't know exactly, like, well, was he a complete unknown, or was it like, I mean, it was somebody they could find later, right? Obviously.
Yeah, it almost seemed like they ran in the same circles.
Right. And so she did mention in the documentary she felt comfortable enough to like get in this guy's truck, and she felt confident he was going to take her home. She also prefaces that she had been drinking, and she said, I shouldn't have been doing that. It was really stupid on my part. So that's kind of it's a gray area for me.
Well, yeah. So we have her story, and then we have the story of Christmas holiday of 1978 of a 35-year-old woman named Kay Turner. That honestly, it's a really tragic story, and it has some similarities to several of like these odd stories that we've covered through the years, including like Amy Bechtel. That's who I think of here. Although Amy's a little younger, Kay Turner is a runner. And she literally goes out on, like her morning run on Christmas Eve of 1978, and she has a run-in with Aykroyd.
They were, she wasn't at home, right? They were on a trip.
Yeah. They had, so she takes this trip with her husband and their friends to a place called Camp Sherman, and that's one of the reasons I sort of like compare it to the Wyoming case. She's away. She's not at home, although she's actually on a trip. They're from Eugene and they've gone up to Camp Sherman, and she's literally just getting up to go exercise, and she doesn't come back, and her husband does all the things that you're supposed to do. He gets the police involved. There's a pretty massive search. They zoom in on the husband, Kay Turner's husband, because she had extramarital affairs. Now
they found out she had been with like two different guys on like little trips very recently, right?
Yeah. And there's a lot of interesting aspects to the Turner case. So this is one of those things where you have to place everything in time. So this would have been a year and a half after the incident with Marlene being raped by John Aykroyd, but surviving. So now that's in 1977.
I feel like it's really important to point out, like you said, in 1977, when Marlene had her encounter with him, she did go to the police. The police took her story. The police, I believe they interviewed him, and nothing was done.
Correct.
It was a he said, she said, even though she, got a rape kit done and there were signs of a sexual assault. He pretty much said, well, she wanted it. And, he just disputed everything. And at the end of the day, she had willingly gotten to the vehicle with him, and he had taken her home at the end of it all, or taken her wherever she asked him to go.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I fault the investigators, specifically in this instance. I feel like while some cases like that are brought and they're he said, she said type things, I think with the evidence that was available, as far as like the rape kit situation. And there was mention of a knife being involved and that he admitted the knife was there. I think that would have been enough evidence that it should have moved forward and somebody besides law enforcement should have decided who they believed. But that's neither here nor there except for what keeps happening. But I do feel like him getting away with that bolsters it. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I feel like that's important in time and space because he did this to her. I 1,000% believe her. She wasn't lying, right?
Correct.
And it bolstered his confidence, I feel like, because he got away with it.
Yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to point out was it's almost like he started to have this sort of invincible feeling is what I'm picturing. This guy is not the brightest dude, but he is like he works. He's working for. He's essentially they say highway mechanic, but I want to clarify the description of his job is that he is essentially on all these different routes for the state. He's working for the state and he does a wide variety of things. It actually sounded like really familiar to me when I was listening to them talk about him. I was picturing sort of what Keyes described having done up on the Yakima reservation when he worked for the reservation in Parks and Rec and he was doing construction and he was at all these different places. It's very similar to that. He's just doing it for the highway department of the state of Oregon.
Right. It sounded like when there would be like a stranded motorist or like just a variety of sort of like it's not really a handyman, but it's like it's a jack of all trades at kind of a low level, right?
Yeah.
Like, somebody runs out of gas, they help people that are stranded motorists, which now that part, I do want to look a little more into that aspect of possible things that occurred, right?
Yeah. It made me do the same thing. So in the documentary, one person mentions, and I think he was either a supervisor or he might have been a coworker, but it sounded like at least at one point there was a supervisory position between this guy and Aykroyd because he says, I took Aykroyd to the scene of an accident, a cleanup, and I'm pretty sure he said that there was a deceased person in the car. He wanted to see how Aykroyd interacted with this deceased person, and he says he was shocked by what happened there, and how calm and collected and sort of flippant Aykroyd was when they were dealing with sort of being a liaison between the first responders and the coroner because the scene had to be cleaned up in order for them to retrieve the body. And, so Aykroyd ends up doing it. I thought that was interesting. He stood out to me in this.
Well, sure. Right. And, we know more about this guy and this was like a story in hindsight sort of, but so I didn't know like if he was telling it from hindsight, you know what I mean? And
yeah.
So I try not to put too much stock.
I know. I thought the same thing.
How people react to things. Cause I feel just the way I am and my experience and then some of the people around me and knowing them really well and what they've experienced, I could face some really shocking situations and I could be very calm about it externally. Okay.
Yeah.
That does not mean anything, right? I'm very conscientious, and I feel like you are too. Like some things that would really shock some people, I breathe my way through them. And people might say like, well, she didn't respond right? That doesn't mean that I didn't respond right in my head. It's just I outwardly, because I'm an emotional type person. And when I was young, I would cry at everything, right? And as I got older, I learned that like you don't cry at everything. But that doesn't mean I don't feel like crying. And that's just an example. But I try not to put too much stock in like how somebody reacts. But I do understand what the guy was saying, right?
Yeah. And it's true crime. So I'm always kind of questioning like, It would be the same effect as like, how the past is revered, which you and I point out a lot. The idea would be like, could have done something. I will say that guy stood out to me, but more than anyone, Marlene stood out to me because she had some serious survivor's guilt, even in the interview she did for this piece many, many years later. She thought if she had done something differently, said something differently, and the police had taken her seriously, that there would have been a possibility that some of these women might have survived. And that is an incredibly hard position for her to have been in. And that affected me even just watching her like talk about it, because she's right. If she had been taken seriously with that rape and he had been, convicted and sentenced, I do believe Kate Turner would be alive. If nothing else, from the fact that it would spoil the timeline.
Well, and he wouldn't have gotten away with it is the whole thing there, I think. I feel like more than anything, like we said, it was in the spring of 77. We have just recently talked about how, sexual assaults and rapes were not taken seriously enough, I say the 80s because that was what I was sort of familiar with, but it's taken a really long time for it to be like, oh, wow, that's like, an actual crime, right?
Yeah.
And one thing this documentary does, which I always, I don't know that enjoy is the best word, but I appreciate it, was they had his recorded interviews, right? We actually get to hear John Aykroyd talking.
Yeah.
And when I was listening, I couldn't really tell if he was serious in his account of what happened between him and Marlene. Like, did he really think like what he was doing was okay? Because even as he's talking with the investigators to profess that it was a consensual encounter, to me, it oozed the fact that like that would not have been accepted today, right? There's a lot of things that were once considered like, oh, well, this is a consensual situation that she regretted after the fact, right?
Yeah.
She was intoxicated to the point she wanted to go home. That's enough right there, right?
Yeah.
For it to be an issue. And so I think that I don't know that she lives with a lot of guilt. I have a ton of respect for her sitting down. This documentary, I don't know if it's aired anywhere.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I was covering it here and going to start pointing people to it, is because I can't find like a good, so I can find it online. I can look at it. I clearly shared it with you, but I can't find that it's gotten a good audience anywhere. So I wanted to talk about it and some of the important things that they cover. I don't even know if they understood the impact that documentary has when they released it. They might have understood some of it, but I don't think they understood the whole thing.
I believe that the maker, the person who organized it and produced it and did all this, I think she probably did, right?
Yeah.
But she was sort of grasping at, this world of true crime that just everything gets swallowed up sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And this is incredibly, it should, and my thought was, we did watch it on YouTube, and YouTube can be hit or miss for things. Like, they can be really great. This is a very high quality thing, in my opinion, on YouTube.
Yes, it is.
It could absolutely be on any other network and it would be worth watching, right? Because, with YouTube, sometimes it's like home videos, right? I mean, I know I'm old for that. I get it. But this documentary should be on, available. Somebody should pick it up and show it. The time was put into it and it was worthwhile. But when Marlene is talking, I feel like she got a lot of information from participating in this. I don't think she necessarily followed John Aykroyd for the rest of his life as far as like what happened to him.
Right.
and the things that he did. And I could tell that I feel like she's much older now, right? Her attack happened in 1977 and she's 20 years old. So I feel like she was at a point where she could kind of digest the fact that like it wasn't her fault. She actually did everything she could. She went to the police but she was, heartbroken about, his victims that came after her.
Yeah, she was, and I want to touch on a couple of things that are in the documentary. So, I had questions about the case of Kay Turner, where if Aykroyd is involved, and that's all I'm going to say here, because like legally speaking, yes, he is, but there's this like he basically gets a pass for 12 years, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But okay, I want to ask you just off the cuff: do you believe that he killed Kay Turner?
I do.
Okay, so Kay Turner, we had briefly touched on her like earlier in this episode, in another episode. I have questions about the death of Kay Turner, but not about Aykroyd necessarily. I just cannot figure out how he so we were talking about his confidence building up from getting away with the assault on Marlene. And then so it's a year and a half later, it's the Christmas holiday, and Aykroyd manages to be involved, seen at the scene. Like he then like is interviewed about the death of Kay Turner. And it appears that he and another man named Roger Dale Beck, who is admittedly a friend of Aykroyd, but I will say Aykroyd, talking to the local news, throws Roger Dale Beck under the bus as the sole perpetrator, which I thought was weird that they had that clip.
Right.
Because it's very old. It's from 1979, and I was blown away that they had that. However, actually, I say it's from 1979. The incident's from 1979, and the latest the news clip could possibly be is like 1991, maybe. But what's bizarre about this case is it happens in 1978, and in 1979, Aykroyd finds, I put that in giant air quotes, Kay Turner's remains in the woods. It's about a half mile off the road that she'd been running along, which points out some flaws in the search and rescue efforts. She had been kidnapped and killed, according to, I don't know how they came to that conclusion. I'll say this. All they had at the end was Kay Turner's skull, and that always bothers me. If all they have is a skull, because you get into yeah, all the bones were animal bones.
What?
All of the bones except for her skull turn out to be animal bones in the documentary.
Okay, well, hold on, because
it's wild, right?
Well, no, that's not what I got from that. I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to contradict you. It was a lot of information kind of all at once, because it is like a 4-part thing, but I watched it all at once, right?
Yeah.
My understanding was that in a later story that he told about finding, because you remember how he was saying like the smell was awful?
You were correct, yes.
And he found bones, right? So there is no smell associated with bones. And then he talks about finding her skull, but I thought I heard somebody say that like that wasn't initially like where he found, quote, found the remains, end quote, that her skull wasn't there.
So the way that yeah, there were remains there. What it was there was really just clothing there, and they did find the skull and the mandible. But the bones that they found with the clothing were ultimately determined to have been scattered animal bones. And the clothing was the important part, because that is how they realized. So they come to the conclusion that she was kidnapped and killed because they felt like her clothing had been cut off of her. It wasn't picked at by animals, and it wasn't ruined by weathering. It's a year later, but essentially they were able to determine that her jogging clothing had been cut. And that was sort of one of the things that made them interested. But this is the part that was infuriating. They do nothing with that information.
They did absolutely nothing.
Now, they do look at Aykroyd in 1978, 1979, particularly in 1979, because he's a witness at the scene in 78. And then in 1979, he finds the remains. He keeps inserting himself into this.
Well, right. So it was one highway worker, so a coworker or somebody who did sort of the same job as him. He saw a runner as well as he saw John Aykroyd. Right?
Yeah, this is Thomas Hanna. He is someone who's familiar with John Aykroyd more than he would have been with the runner.
Right. Okay. And so that places him in the vicinity the morning she was running. Right.
Right.
There's also another runner. Right. And she's brought up in the documentary, and she went to testify about the fact that she was the other runner, because during the investigation people had seen a runner, and the possibility was it was the other runner or it was Kay Turner. Right. And so she went to make that distinction for people. Right. Because they wanted information about who had seen Kay. Right.
Right. And the other jogger information in the documentary is pretty fascinating, by the way.
It is. And so she had an encounter with John Aykroyd.
Yeah, she ends up really bolstering the case for him having killed Kay Turner, but she makes no mention of Roger Beck.
I'm sorry, she wasn't running. She was on a bike. I'm sorry.
There's another person out exercising. I thought she was a jogger as well.
Wait. Hold on. I'm sorry. I think I messed that up. I do believe she was running, but she talks about a different incident where she's on a bike.
So where we end up with this is, in my opinion, okay, they bring in Aykroyd and they talk to him after the remains are recovered. And Aykroyd's explanation for the smell thing is, I actually saw those remains a while ago. It was more like February, and I smelled them, but I didn't report it at the time. So how long do you think it would? That's what I don't know. That's what he says. He says, I didn't report it back then. So what the investigator says, because there's a couple of investigators involved that talk in this documentary, what they think he was doing was they think he had decided, you know what? I'm going to double down on this and try and get the reward. I'm going to tell them where the body is. And once they close that, I'll get the reward. That's what they thought he was thinking. Because they were going to, I think in Aykroyd's head, he was going to point to Roger Dale Beck. Now, there is some damning evidence that comes up against Roger Dale Beck in the documentary. But I just want to say this. They do nothing for 11 years. Nothing.
That's correct. So when we initially talked about this, I hadn't watched the documentary yet, and I was going off of sort of what was available for me to read about, and I had thought perhaps Aykroyd wasn't involved. There is an alibi witness, which is it's Beck's wife, our former wife, right?
Pamela Beck, yeah.
And so she, after they get divorced, she lets authorities know that the alibi she had given him was a lie, right?
Yeah.
And she gives them additional information about what actually happened that day. If you'll recall in the documentary, they mention that it's Christmas time, and Roger Dale Beck didn't have food to eat, and they were going out hunting for deer, so they would have deer meat, venison, right?
Right.
And I immediately thought to myself, it is so unlikely that he would have, because he had children, right? Children that were hungry. Why would he be thinking about murder, right? Those two things were just, it sort of clashed in my mind. And then, of course, with the ex-wife coming forward and her story, I mean, it was what it was, and I'm not saying she's lying. I do, however, make note in my mind of the investigator that was talking. So he kind of illustrates one of the things I've talked about over time, where they know a case is solved, but they don't have the evidence to adjudicate it, right? He says, like, we knew who did this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so without more information, there was nothing they could do. But he mentions that because there was something about her running tracks, because Nike was a new shoe.
She had a waffle pattern to the shoe.
And so they were able to say, like, this was her running path, right?
Yep.
And they could tell that it was one set of her running shoes and the path she had taken. And then there was like work boots, and there was one set of work boots, right?
Yeah, there were deep work boots tracked, indicating a larger person in work boots, and they assumed larger man. And it looked like at that scene that there had been a scuffle, and that the person with the Nike shoes, their tracks discontinued. And
like they were picked up or drug or whatever.
Yeah, and then all there were drag marks away from that area.
Right. And so to me, like, that's one person getting her, right?
Right.
And so I felt like, and we talked about how he wasn't the brightest bulb. Definitely not the brightest bulb. But I think that he did go out hunting with Beck. Now, and Beck was not like, he wasn't an angel, right? But right. This is about John Aykroyd. But I think that he was using him as a scapegoat. Now, earlier I said I felt like maybe John Aykroyd was not involved in that. But like, after I watched the documentary, I realized, somebody saw him in the vicinity that day. He found her body, and then because he was talking about a smell that wouldn't have been there with the bones, he makes up this story about how he had found her body earlier in the year but didn't report it. And this guy went, this is my speculation, he went back there and watched her decompose.
Oh, he definitely did. He went back to the scene, and that's what we're getting out of. And it's his interviews that give that away.
I think so too. And they found at the scene of where her remains were found, there were enough dental records that, enough dental, you said the mandible. I remember seeing the teeth and they had matched it, right?
Yeah.
But some birds had made a nest
out of blonde hair,
pulling her hair out as, she was, going back to dust, basically. But I felt like that was just, it was something. But so this guy, that type of thing definitely makes me lean more towards like the serial killer type, right?
Yeah, the going back to the body it's a strange thing that is done and is known to be, it's a way for them to assuage the idea of killing someone else for a period of time. That's the idea behind it. Go ahead.
Why do you think that he ultimately gave up the remains?
He wanted the reward. He wanted the money from the reward. That was his idea there. He thought he was going to get away with it. It had been long enough. There was no evidence of him there. He had been to the scene many times, and he had realized that most of the bones were gone. But the skull was still there, and her clothing was still there. And he thought at that point in time he would be safe to try and get the reward for her, for the missing persons reward. That's what he wanted. He wanted the money.
That's crazy to me. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so they do nothing about this. I'm coming back around to this fact. They do nothing about this.
So he gets away with it again for a period of time.
Yeah. Okay. And I want to point out that from the time he gets away with Marlene and this until the next incident, there are 46 missing women in Oregon. Still to this day unknown what happened to 46 different women. I think some of them may be underage. I don't have the sitting in front of me, but I went and look that up to see if I could link anyone. There are a number of cases they suspect that Aykroyd is involved in, including Swamp Mountain Jane Doe, who is not on my list of 46 missing women. But the three people that they sort of pin on him. Okay, the first one we talked about briefly, and I apologize because I mispronounced her name. I didn't know it until I went back to the documentary. But her name is Richanda Pickle. She is so Aykroyd somehow gets married in the 1980s. He's got a stable job, and he marries a woman named Linda Pickle. And she has two kids. Richanda and Byron Pickle are her kids. They are terribly poor. Terribly, terribly, terribly poor. So Linda being married to Aykroyd does a lot for their financial status, which I think when that happens, sometimes people don't look as hard at things as they could. There was a lot of indicators that Aykroyd was getting away with a lot of physical and sexual abuse with Richanda. Now, the way that it's told in the documentary is not the way that it's told in mainstream media, and that is that there's a confrontation about Aykroyd molesting Richanda, who is 13 years old, and the next day, she vanishes. This is what makes them look at the old cases. This is what makes them go back. And in fact, what happens is this case is a missing child's case, and it makes its way anyway to the DA because this all happens in 1990. Richanda goes missing in 1990. So there's a big gap in time between the Kay Turner case, which is December of 1978, and Richanda is in July. It's July 10th of 1990 when she goes missing. So it's a very long period of time between these two cases. But essentially, the Lynn County district attorney who is over Richanda's missing persons case, this guy named Doug Martini, he actually calls. At the time, he was not the district attorney; he was assistant district attorney, I believe. He calls the investigator on some of the older cases down in Jefferson County, and he just says, "Are you guys familiar with John Aykroyd?" And the investigator in the documentary, he says, "Yeah, I picked up the phone, I heard him, and he asked me if I knew who John Aykroyd was." And I said, "Yeah, he killed Kay Turner." So they knew, but when Richanda goes missing, they really start looking at him. Now, it takes them a little bit. They end up, from the time she goes missing in 1990, it takes them about 3 years to really get an idea of what's going on with Aykroyd. And essentially, they arrest him. His relationship had ended basically the day Richanda went missing. His relationship with Linda ended. He moves in with his mom, and he ends up being arrested, but not for Richanda's case. He gets arrested and he gets charged for Kay Turner's case. He gets indicted by a Jefferson County grand jury. They go after him in 1992, and they go after Roger Dale Beck. And in October of 1993, he's convicted of aggravated murder for rape, murder, and shooting Kay Turner. He gets a life sentence. Beck, who had told his family about it, people in his family about it, he ends up being found guilty in November 1993 of her murder at a separate trial, same county, and he gets put away as well. I'm not 100% sure of Beck's involvement. I believe he is involved. I don't know how involved. But I will say this. There's 46 cases that women have gone missing in this area. But they do link him pretty directly to a 1992 double missing person case. That is not a missing persons case now. It is two young women who were murdered. Their names were Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson. They were on a camping trip with Melissa Sanders' family in 1992 at Beverly Beach State Park. They were bored and they decided to go hitchhiking. And they were presumed to have had friends bring them back to Sweet Home. They lived off of Highway 20, which is the whole reason that we got on this, is Highway 20 is sort of this, weaving road here that ties all this together. They were regulars at the same restaurant Aykroyd was at. But what really got him was co-workers of Aykroyd remembered him coming into the highway shop. When I say shop, it's like an automotive shop. And he had come in one night and he was covered in blood, and he kind of blew off his co-workers. And when they asked him like why he was covered in blood, and he said that he had hit a deer and he had to gut him out, and then he chucked the carcass off along the highway, which the co-workers didn't think a whole lot of it because they thought Aykroyd was kind of weird and would probably do something like that, like during a shift. But at the end of it, they started putting the time frame together, and it ties him in time to, they believe that it was the night of those two girls, Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson, going missing. Now, their bodies were found off an old logging highway off of Highway 20. If you just look at like the little area there around where they went missing, there's 5 teenagers that went missing between 1984 and 1995. Melissa and Sheila's bodies get found about a month before Aykroyd is indicted and arrested for the murder of Kay Turner. But he's decided at this point he doesn't want to talk to the police anymore. And there is no forensic evidence that ties Aykroyd to the murder of the girls. But they did figure out that there were witnesses saying that Aykroyd had met the girls earlier and offered them a ride. And this was not the night of. This is seeing them hitchhiking in the months previous. And he had invited them to a couple of different parties. Aykroyd was seen by witnesses parked on the logging road off Highway 20 where the girls' bodies were 3 different times between the time they went missing in spring of 1992 and the time he was arrested in October 1993. Because you have to remember, after Rachando went missing, cops were watching him. So what did you think about that one? Do you think he probably did that?
Well,
I thought if they saw him sitting on that side road, he is sitting there reliving having killed those girls the same way he did Kay Turner.
I agree with that line of thinking. I wasn't sure, and I meant to look this up, and I ran out of time before we started recording today. But I heard that case was closed. It
is closed. It was reopened in 2012. Ron Benson, he was not a cop, but he was an investigator. He and Linda Snow got involved in that investigation. They noted some similarities. They had enough evidence for a grand jury, but they felt like it was going to be too expensive to move forward. That's what they say in the documentary. They say it was so expensive that they didn't feel like they could do it.
Well, right. But my question was, I wasn't 100% sure. Was it closed because they felt like John Aykroyd did it?
Yeah. So their intentions were that they were going to take it to a grand jury to indict him. But since he was already in prison, and because it's such a cash-strapped area, basically his boss talked to him about how expensive it was going to be, and they sort of decided that they weren't going to like chase it down. They were going to close it out, and they were going to tag Aykroyd's name on it. And I didn't agree with all of that, but they did it anyways.
Right. And okay, that was my confusion there. I am aware that the whole grand jury thing, I remember hearing that, but then like one of the last things I heard was, the case was closed, and I was like, well, that's really strange. And I wasn't entirely clear. Now, I don't know if he did it or not. To me, the documentary left me going, well, I've got more to look into about this, right?
That's what it did to me too. But I wanted to talk to you about it because I did like it. I think people should watch it.
I agree.
The bottom line on this is this is a really good example of somebody who is in my opinion, he's a serial killer. I didn't really know a lot about John Arthur Aykroyd. I feel like the documentary plus my own research is pointing me that way. I do think he killed those girls, the 2 girls. I wasn't 100% positive that he did. And, the Ghost of Highway 20, which is what this is about. It's not just about John Aykroyd, by the way. Although this documentary is, there's a lot more commonalities he has with a bunch of unidentified bodies found out there, in the fact that like he was sort of leaving them out instead of burying them, including Swamp Mountain Jane Doe. And I believe she's unidentified to this day. She was found in Sweet Home, Oregon. It was before this. It was in July of 1976. What did you think? Like overall, like what do you think of John Aykroyd? Do you think he killed these? I would say he raped Marlene. I think he killed Kay Turner. I think he killed Richanda. Which he does plead out to. The plea deal was sealed. We had questions in an earlier episode where we were like, what are they talking about? Because it was a really weird thing the prosecutor did. But it was another case where he agreed to plead no contest to it. They sealed the deal until after his death, but then he died shortly thereafter, and they made it public.
Right. And so that is covered in the documentary, and it brings up some very interesting aspects of like the victims' lives and Richanda's life, right?
Yeah.
Richanda's mom is on the show, her brother, two of her school friends, and they have a lot to say about her. She was a 13-year-old girl. And there was a confrontation. Their father, who wasn't John Aykroyd, they'd gone to visit him, and it was brought to somebody brought it to his attention, and then he kind of confronted the kids, I guess. And then there was a fallout between Richanda and her biological father, and she went back home, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And her brother had stayed. And essentially, the documentary sort of like touches on it, but it also is apparent to me, and I'm sure you and any other viewer as well, like the brother and sister were, sort of a team, and it seemed like they were both, without question, based on the friends that are interviewed, they were abused children, more than likely at the hands of John Aykroyd, right?
Correct.
And without her brother there, it was like, once again, John Aykroyd seized an opportunity, right? Because she was there alone. And she had stayed home, and he had gone to work and then came back home, and then, she's never seen again. He convinces the mom not to call the police until the following day. And they play this like heart-wrenching 911 call, and that 911 operator is like, well, why haven't you called earlier? And she's like, well, I thought like you had to wait for 24 hours. And the 911 operator is like, well, no, not with children. Right. And so her mother was clueless about everything that was occurring. She doesn't even acknowledge really that they were abused by him. Did you? I don't know.
Yeah, she did. She flat out says she didn't know.
Now her brother knew. In fact, when he found out she was missing, he panicked. It doesn't really say what their age difference was, but it wasn't much, I don't think. Just, a few years.
Yeah, they were close in age.
Okay, and so he was sort of her protector, and so he's about to get out of jail for his for Kay Turner's murder. And Byron alone, without anyone there to support him, I believe his wife was there, but his parents have checked out of this whole thing, and in the interest of just sort of being neutral, I'm assuming they couldn't deal with it, right? Richanda has never been found, right? She went missing that day, and she vanished off the face of the earth, and she's never been found. And so Byron, having lived the life he did and experienced what he experienced in his life, he's faced with this choice. And the choice he has to make is to let John Aykroyd plead no contest to, was it her murder or just the abduction?
They don't specify. The plea deal was basically for the abduction.
Okay. And so, and what that does is it means that John Aykroyd has agreed that he will basically stay in jail for the rest of his life. However, it's
right.
I'm sorry. However, he's
not long is what I said. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I said not long, but yeah.
Well, right, but he didn't know that, I don't think. But but he's pleading no contest, right? That's not a guilty plea. However, and Byron talks about it on the documentary. He struggled with, should I do this? Is this justice for her? Like, is it enough? And essentially, at the end of the day, he says, this guy can't get out of prison. I can't take the chance that he's ever going to walk the streets again, and no contest it is, right? Which is, it gives you sort of an idea of what losing your 13-year-old sister to the man that's your stepfather, who's supposed to be, supporting and protecting you. I mean, he recognized the significance in, saying, okay, plead no contest to it, but you're never getting out. And that's what I care about. Because that man was dangerous. There's no question he would have done it again. And I don't know what makes people like him tick, so to speak. Of course, he's dead now, so he's not ticking at all. But one thing I am going to see what I can kind of dig up on. I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot. When you get into these like much older cases, it's not like there's a ton of, stuff you can go look up on people. But I would like to know more about his life, like before sort of where it picks up, right? Because we pick up this story with his first victim.
Right.
And so we don't know a whole lot like we did with some of the other killers that we've talked about, right? And part of our study in these guys, whether or not he ends up being a serial killer, to me in my mind, there's no question that there's enough evidence here to support that statement, right? And the, genesis, if you will, of these guys is very interesting, whatever we can find out. And so I am interested in sort of seeing that. I am, I feel like people who experience certain things, like Byron Pickle with his sister, he knew enough based on the years and years and years it took to get justice for his sister that, like, you have to give and take some. And so, he is largely responsible for the fact that John Aykroyd died in prison as opposed to getting parole for Kay Turner's murder.
Right. He is. And I think it's the only thing he could do. I have a lot of questions about this. It opens up a whole new mystery for me. I just thought it was interesting that it comes about in the middle of us researching this Ipana stuff. The timeline is similar, very different reactions from the U.S. side of things and the Canadian side of things. But what we're left with is a bunch of unsolved missing persons cases and a bunch of unsolved cases that happen in this guy's orbit. I want to know more about him now. And was Marlene a fluke, or was she really the first victim? Like, there's so many things that I want to know from the perspective of like what did this guy do? I would encourage people to check out the documentary. I know I'll be going to do some research on John Aykroyd now that I've kind of dug into him, even though it's in the middle of us researching 10 other things. And I do think it'll come back up for me, and I'm sure it'll come back up for you.
I would like to see, and I haven't looked, maybe you have, I would really like for Richanda to be found.
That was a big one for me.
It is. So she would actually be a little older than me. Not much, right? But a little bit. And I never heard of her case. The documentary, the way that it's done, it is about the victims largely. Marlene makes a few comments that are just heartbreaking, but essentially she says that I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this documentary maker, the team that did this, they were the first to ever approach her. And they typically don't name rape victims. And at the end, like, they're wanting her, to say, well, should we name you or not? She's like, absolutely. She's like, I want everybody to know, what this happened. And her thought is to bring awareness, not necessarily because John Aykroyd's still out there. He's not, he's dead. But it is to bring awareness to situations where, like, when something's happening, maybe it would save somebody, essentially. If you see things happening that, like in her case, this guy gives her a ride, she gets attacked, and then it's ignored. Now, I don't know that would happen now, but a lot of the investigators clearly have regret, right? They talk about it. And then she's heartbroken over this young girl who, she was just basically snuffed out at, a very young age. And for me, as an adult female, it really sort of highlights, at least from the perspective that he was her stepfather and he did this, and, he does eventually plead no contest to it. But for the most part, he got away with it, right?
Yeah, he got off really easy.
It highlights that marginalized. Now, they were poor, but, nothing had happened in Rashanda's life yet that would make her fit into any category of anything, right? She was a kid. Right. And so it's kind of the vilest of the vile, right? When you've got a grown man doing what he did to her, making her disappear. And the worst part of it is, with the friends talking, she knew this was going to happen to her.
Oh, absolutely, she knew.
And what she must have gone through is just, it pulls at my heart because, there was nothing she could do. She couldn't, she couldn't fix the situation for herself. And, there's a line between getting involved in other people's lives and not doing anything. And it seems to me like this could have been very easily avoided, and it wasn't. And nobody could help her. Every single adult in the situation that she found herself in and she sought help from, nobody helped her.
No, they didn't. It is an absolutely tragic story. I encourage people to go and watch it. And it'll come back up for us. Do you have anything else you want to throw out about it?
Not right now, no, but I do feel like we will, we'll talk some more about this as I get, if, I do more research and it seems like there's more relevant stuff.
Agreed. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
You messed this up like you always do.